Let's get started. My guest was an aide to 3 presidents, author of the new book, The Greatest Comeback. Please welcome back to the program, Patrick J. Buchanan.
How are you, Raymond?
Great to see you again.
Good to see you, my friend.
Now, let's talk about this.
Sure.
The GOP in 1965 is faced with a 2-time loser in Richard Nixon. This guy had just lost in a huge way. You see similarities between his situation, where the GOP is now. What's the answer? What's the lesson?
Well, the Republican Party in 1965 had lost 2 straight national elections. The last one, a complete disaster, 25 points, 44 states. Nixon himself was a loser. There are a number of things that are part of the answer. The first one is Nixon went out in 1966 and campaigned, first in 1964. He went out and fought and bled for Barry Goldwater in the full knowledge that the party was going down to disastrous defeat to save as many as he could. And he was rewarded with thanks and gratitude from an awful lot of conservatives. 66, he went out and did the same thing, predicted he's going to pick up 40 states at Lyndon Johnson's expense, got 47 states. So that, I think, the idea of loyalty and fighting for the party, which were natural to him, turned out to be also advantageous to him.
Because he even described himself as a progressive conservative, Pat. He was hardly Barry Goldwater or Ronald Reagan material.
Right. When I went up and had my meeting with him for 3 hours and was hired, he looked at me and said, "You're conservative. You're not as conservative as Bill Buckley, are you?" I said, "I have great respect for Bill Buckley."
Oh, boy. Look at that. The Buchanan dodge right from the beginning.
That was a problem area in the interview I did.
How did you come to meet him? How did you first meet?
I met him in St. Louis. The first time I met him, I was about 14 years old at the Burning Tree Country Club.
Oh, my.
Sitting on the caddy log out there late in the afternoon when the plaid golf bag of the Vice President of the United States comes out. And the assistant pro looks over at me and my friend Pete Cook, and he's really wary. These amateur caddies are there. And he brought us, and I went around 18 holes with Richard Milhouse Nixon at Burning Tree when I was about 14 or 15. About 10 years later, I'm in St. Louis, editorial writer. I got myself invited to a cocktail party. I wanted to meet him. Went up to him in the kitchen and said, "If you're going to run in 1968, I'd like to get aboard early." 2 weeks later, I was in his office in New York for a 3-hour interview.
Wow. There is something in the book, there's a moment where you say, you have these memos that go back and forth.
Right.
And what I love about the book is, I've read a lot about Richard Nixon, read a number of biographies, read all of his memoirs. I had never seen these memos. Where did these memos come from, Pat?
They came deep in my basement. Look,
Rich, you got your own National Archive in there.
I've had them in there for years and years, have not seen them for years and years, going into them. But what they were was, the way I dealt with Nixon is, he was in the next office. And rather than go in and ask, I would type out a memo, and this, you know, and I'd make a lot of mistakes, as you can see in the memos, typing and things, right? And then I'd put them into a pile and give them to him, drop them in his briefcase. He'd take them home, and he'd come back and write notes the next day, excellent analysis, get in touch with him. No, this guy's a such and such, no.
Colorful memos.
Stay away from him and everything. Yeah. But we had a terrific communication. And then I spent about 2, 3, 4 hours a day sitting across from him because he was tremendously intellectually curious. He would come in and he said, "Okay, now tell me why you conservatives believe this." And we'd argue something back and forth, and he would come back. You know, once or twice I came out agreeing with his original position, and he was agreeing with mine, you know, but he was tremendously, it's politics, personality, issues, foreign policy especially, intellectually alive, aware. And I think, you know, dreaming that after all these defeats, there was still a path down that sideline to the goal line.
What you realize when you read this is the great influence that you had on him. I mean, his disposition was normally to the moderate and sort of to the left. I mean, this is the guy who founded the EPA and the National Endowment for the Arts. He
was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. I said, we got to get rid of that one, you know.
So you were trying to make him ready for prime time in the Republican Party.
I was the first Goldwater conservative, you know, the post-war conservative movement that arose with National Review, Goldwater movement, and the rest of it. The first one, I think, in his entourage. All of the folks previously with Nixon and his staff in '60 really were down on the right wing because they had gutted Nixon in California, the governor's race, disliked the Goldwater people and everything. But I was there, and I was, you know, far, far more conservative than Nixon was, but he was very interested in what you had to say. And I said, look, the thing we got to do, Raymond, is, I said, if we can marry the Goldwater right to the Nixon center of the party, there's nobody on the left that can beat us for the nomination. We can crowd them out. and then we can move and get those Northern Catholics who are socially conservative, like my family, the guys I went to school with, and the Southern Protestants who are breaking now because they don't like the liberalism of the Democratic Party, but are currently with Wallace, and we can build a great coalition to defeat FDR.
Is there a lesson here for the political parties as they exist today, for both the Democratic and the Republican parties? The Republican Party, let's face it right now, though they have majorities here in the House and they're creeping up in the Senate, nationally, it seems to be very disunified.
It's hard to see the president. I mean, I could see back then a presidential coalition that could defeat the Democratic coalition of FDR for years. And Kevin Phillips was writing his book then about that very idea, 68, and he came aboard. And what did I say? I wrote Nixon a memo. I said, there is an awesome creature out here in my office. I mean, he was so brilliant. He was so brilliant that he got it and others got it. But today, you know, I can't see it, Raymond. I mean, there's 18 states that have gone Democratic 6 straight times, and they're getting more Democratic, and the demography is moving against us because Hispanic population is growing, Asian population is growing, African and population growing. They go between 70 and 90% Democratic in every presidential elections, and they are growing. And the European American population is gradually shrinking in size. It's moving towards 60% of the population and 70% of the electorate.
Tell me, as you look at the candidates that are out there, Rand Paul and Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio and Paul Ryan and Rick Santorum. And
can you stand the excitement?
I'm glad you said that, Pat.
Shouldn't have said that.
Chris
no, look,
Christie.
there's a lot of them. I know Rand Paul, and he's got a lot of qualities. I admire his courage in standing up on the war issue.
Can any of them beat Hillary Clinton?
At this point, I don't think so. I think what we need, and here's one thing that Nixon had going for him, it was luck in a sense, but he was coming back at the very point the Democratic Party, the great coalition, twice as large as the Republican Party, was falling apart. George Wallace was ripping off not only the South, but all these populist Catholic conservatives in the North. They loved that message he was giving them, you know, there's not a dime's worth of difference between the two parties. Then you had the left, Bobby Kennedy, Eugene McCarthy, George McGovern, moving anti-war, savaging Johnson, you know, appealing to the kids who were yelling, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? And eventually, you know, the Ho Chi Minh, the NLF is going to win. And so all those were inside the Democratic Party, and they were all pulling apart. And that's what gave us the opportunity to seize fractions, big fractions of that party on the center right.
He tells you something very early on. In 1966, he said, before you can even think about 68, running in 68, we have to restore the party base.
Exactly.
Do you see that message needing to resonate now?
I think needing it, I think that's exactly right. But look where the base was in 1965. When I talked to him in that kitchen, that's exactly what he said. Republicans had 140 House seats, the Democrats 295. We had 32 senators, they had 68. I think we had 17 governors, about 1/3 of the governors. And so that base was shrunken, but the base Republicans have got today is much larger, 90 more seats in the House. But you look at the future, and you don't see that bright light over the horizon. It looks like it may be twilight for the GOP.
This is the man who wrote Where the Right Went Wrong, the Suicide of a Superpower. So much
Death of the West, all that very positive work.
Yeah, all those positive, uplifting books. But everything you write about in those books has largely come to pass. And I mean, we'll get into some of that in a moment. Before I leave Nixon, we have to ask, where did this idea come of the forgotten American, the great silent majority, as he would later
that came
describe
out,
them?
I mean, the 60s, what happened, the 60s, you had soaring crimes, you had urban riots, you had anarchy by the overprivileged on the campuses, and all in denunciations and demonstrations everywhere. And Nixon kept saying, look, there's people out there, hardworking people, tax-paying folks who love this country, and we use forgotten Americans and quiet Americans and other phrases. And in one memo I mentioned twice the phrase silent majority, and it's double underlined by Richard Nixon, and it would pop up in 1969 in that great speech, basically that made his presidency, the great silent majority to stand up behind me. Nixon soared to 68% approval. You know, and this was not a charismatic.
Did you write that speech?
Nixon wrote that speech entirely by himself. Nobody helped him on it. But I will say I sent him memos and saying, we're at a fateful point in the presidency. Either we're going to run the country or this crowd out in the street's going to run it. And I think you've got to go on national television, deliver a speech. The next day, Nixon said there'll be a speech on November 3rd.
My goodness. Now look, like Goldwater, you doubled down when you ran for president twice. You didn't tack to the left a bit and try to, it seems you didn't play the coalitions quite the way
that isn't the way you
Nixon
overthrow a president of the United States. Look, George H.W. Bush was at 90% 6 months before I challenged him.
Right.
What am I going to go in and say, actually, I agree with President Bush on a number of issues, but I'm a more attractive fellow?
You certainly give a better speech.
Well, you had to come on. That whole idea in 1992 was to go and run a campaign, exciting campaign, and get all these young people out, and hope, frankly, that Bush would say what Lyndon Johnson did. You know, I've served one term, and I don't think I'm going to run.
I've had enough.
And then you'd be running to daylight.
I want to talk about something else.
Didn't work.
Well, you tried twice, though, and you gave it your all. Nixon and Reagan, you reveal in the book, had an alliance. I've never seen this anywhere. Where did this come from?
Well, it came out of things in my files and letters and things. And a friend of mine brought some letters that he had gotten out of the Nixon archives, and they seem to be simply letters between Reagan and Nixon, you know. But if you put them all together with the files I had, it looked to me like a deal had been cut at Bohemian Grove in 1967, where Nixon spoke and Reagan was. You know, that's where all the Republican bulls get together.
Yeah.
And the deal was that Nixon would get the first crack at the liberals in the Republican Party, the Rockefeller-Romney wing. And if he hadn't demolished them by Wisconsin, which was the second primary, Reagan would be free to come in and try to grab the nomination. Because the letters were saying, Reagan, Dick, as you know, some of my guys got a little bit out of hand and trying to push me forward, and I had to put them down and things. I understand, Ron, you know, and all that. So, and there was a column by de Toledano which said the deal had been cut, and I sent it into Nixon, and it came back with Nixon's usual check mark. But I had marked that passage where it said just such a deal had been cut, and the very fact that he didn't comment on it told me that he had been the guy behind de Toledano's column. He had been the source. Because de Toledano had been with him ever since the Hiss case.
Interesting. Interesting. What's the compare those two? You worked for both of these men very closely.
Right.
Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. I hope you're going to write the book about the Reagan years as well. Right. Is that coming?
Well,
I know you promised here, part two.
I had about nine years with Nixon and 2 with Reagan in the White House. But this, of course, only covers 3 years. But I would hope to write the sequel to this, and in that deal with the Reagan years as well, the connections between Reagan and Nixon, my days and hours at Reykjavik and some of those other occasions. Yeah.
Those are great stories. Final question. When you look at everything that's happened since your time with Richard Nixon, what do you regret most about that period, and what do you remember most fondly?
Well, what I regret most is certainly the Watergate, which brought down President Nixon and destroyed a tremendously successful presidency. But beyond that, it was what happened to the folks in Saigon and the folks in Cambodia when Nixon's presidency was broken and the North Vietnamese overran the South. What did you get, a million dead in Cambodia, hundreds of thousands, maybe 1 million in the South China Sea, boat people, and the loss of the war. America, I mean, the United States Army didn't lose that war, but America lost that war 2 years, about 8 months after he left, or 10 months after he left office. That's the worst. But one of the best are the times with at Reykjavik, with Ronald Reagan, which was, you thought you're almost in a movie, getting up from the table and walking out, and it was terrific. And there were great times with Richard Milhouse Nixon, and one of them, of course, was that '66 campaign. where we bested Lyndon Baines Johnson. Let me tell you a quick anecdote.
Okay.
After the election in '68, we all went to the White House. The staff of Johnson met with the new staff of Nixon, and we were all introduced to the president. We all walked down the line. And I'd been working on Johnson's case for 3 years with Nixon. So we go up and we shake hands with him. And Lyndon, I said, "How are you, Mr. President? I'm Pat Buchanan." And he looked down at me and said, "I know who you are."
That was it. Well,
the only time
that was like a badge of honor, right?
Let me out of here.
Pat Buchanan, thank you for being here.
Take it easy.
Hope to see you again soon.
Right.
Pat's latest book, The Greatest Comeback, How Richard Nixon Rose from Defeat to Create the New Majority, is available at bookstores everywhere and online.